Hi there, welcome. This is week 8, English 122, Pikes Peak Community College, the online course. This week we're continuing rhetorical analysis, finishing up the unit on arguing to persuade, before we move into the final unit, which will be your researched argument, the synthesis extended researched argument. This week we're looking at logical fallacies, but I also want to include fallacies in general. Fallacies, and then we're going to look at Dr. Seuss's The Sneetches. That will be our final text in the section where we're bringing together three seemingly disparate texts and writers, authors. We want to look at what commonalities they might have in terms of rhetorical analysis and also critical analysis. Now remember, when we're talking about rhetorical analysis as a subsection of critical analysis, you're looking at how something is structured, and you're looking at any kind of flaws in the structure or in the argument itself, anything that would lead you to believe that the argument is not structured well, not reasoned well, illogical, or faulty in some way. Rhetorical analysis is a subsection of critical analysis, and what you're looking for in a rhetorical analysis, you're specifically looking at the decorative elements, persuasive elements, those intentional acts that an author or a rhetor uses towards a specific target audience to get them to agree with and then be persuaded by towards that final so what action. And the three appeals we looked at for rhetorical strategies were the appeal to logic, the appeal to ethics, and the appeal to emotion. Mostly you see appeals to emotion in some of your more informal writing. So letters, text messages, memos, those tend to be more informal, but they also kind of appeal to emotions more. Formal letters or legal briefs, things like that, are looking at appeals to logic, and then also appeals to ethics. And as we saw in King's text, there's a heavy use of appeal to ethics in there because King is a clergyman and he's appealing to his fellow clergymen. So they're using the ethical connection that they have as ministers. So that's a built-in connection. When we're looking at Dr. Seuss specifically, what kind of appeals do you see in that text? And there are going to be appeals to emotions because the target audience is children. So of course you want them to feel a certain way. As Seuss is writing this story about the Sneetches who are outcast, the plain belly Sneetches are outcast on the beaches, and they're in the dark and the cold, and they're missing out on the Frankfurter roast and the marshmallow roasts and having a grand old time. And the Starbelly Sneetches are bullying them unmercifully because of a marking on their belly versus not having a marker on the belly. You want to look at that kind of appeal. Well, naturally there is an appeal to emotion there, but also what kind of logical appeals is he making? What kind of ethical appeals, if any, is he making? Especially when you look at when Sylvester McMonkey McBean comes in with his star on and star off machines, and looking at what he's saying at the end as he drives away with all of the Sneetch's money, saying you can't teach a Sneetch. Embedded in these texts, there's obviously the devices of rhyme and meter. So the rhetorical devices, you could look at repetition, rhyme, and meter. There's a lot of chiasmus, crisscrossing. There's metaphors, there's imagery, the cold, dark beaches, and the Sneetches are moping and doping alone on the beaches. The words that are infused in that text are trying to create that appeal to emotion, or doubling down, decorating that appeal even further. So when you're looking at Seuss's text and looking at King's text, how do they handle the rhetorical strategies for their target audiences? So you have to identify those things in the writing situation we talked about from week 1. Who are their intended audiences? What is the purpose and what is the true subject that is going on in this text? But also thinking about the genre and the context. Context will matter enormously, and you've done that incredibly well, identifying cultural connections or contextual rhetorical connections, the kairos of a situation. from your second analytic essay about advertisements, you bridge that connection beautifully, and you are seeing through that the logic that people embed in an advertisement. You're seeing through to the strategies they're using, but also the rhetorical context, the rhetorical situation, the kairos. You're identifying those. Even if you weren't able to say it was kairos, you were identifying those markers of kairos within those texts. And so you're doing beautifully on your analytic work. Your writing work is really great. So this week, I'm going to talk about logical fallacies specifically, and I have a couple of PowerPoints up. One is part of a PowerPoint that I wrote on logic in argument. So I just renamed it. It's under Unit 3, but within that logic in argument PowerPoint, there's a section on the logical fallacies, and it identifies what kind of fallacies those are and why they are fallacious. Fallacious meaning faulty in some way. But there are also a few other logical fallacy texts that I put up in that Unit 3 section for your reference. Of course, they're just for your reference to help you understand and better identify them. Sometimes one particular strategy doesn't work well for making sense, but others will. So I put Purdue L's section on logical fallacies up there. It's a link to their website. And then Utah Valley University had a pretty good, succinct page that I put on our website as well to talk about logical fallacies and rhetorical strategies and analysis. So you can see why we're looking at them. So why specifically are we looking at logical fallacies? Well, if you recognize a fallacy in writing, whether it's a logical fallacy or an emotional fallacy, an ethical fallacy, a stylistic fallacy, but specifically the logical fallacies we're talking about, if you can recognize them in other people's writing, then you start to take control and authority over that text. It also makes you more suspicious. It makes you a better analyst, evaluator of the text you're reading. So, for example, if you're seeing an advertisement and you're not quite sure whether you want to purchase that product, whether you believe in it or not, if you see no flaws in logic, if you see no fallacious argument throughout, then maybe that is a product that you will endorse and you will eventually purchase. But if you see logical flaws throughout, maybe that's not something you want to purchase, because usually logical fallacies are forgivable, but if that's a continual point of saturation, you start thinking that's intentional. Why? Why are they intentionally trying to mislead? So coming back to the concept of fallacy, what it actually means, the definition of a fallacy is a mistaken belief, or it can be a wrong move, an intentional wrong move or an unintentional wrong move. It can also be something that is a faulty use of an argument or an unsound argument, or finally, a misleading argument in some way. So it's misusing an appeal. That's one way to think about these fallacies. Misusing those appeals to logic, misusing the appeal to emotion, the appeal to ethics. So fallacies can be aligned with those appeals, but they can also be aligned with devices and stylistics. So for example, if you're looking at fallacies of ethos, ethical fallacies in writing, those would be things like personal attacks. If you aren't seeing any kind of political advertisements right now, you are blessed. But if you are seeing them, and unfortunately they are going to be around with us for a few more weeks, hopefully only a few more days, but you'll see personal attacks now. It has devolved down to, well, we've tried the arsenal of logic, we've tried the arsenal of ethical appeals, we've tried the emotional appeals. Now we're going to double back and look at the ethical appeal. He or she is a big ninny head. He or she is a dirty, rotten scoundrel. He or she is, worse than the scum on the bottom of the ocean. what's the point? And so you're looking at that. That's a logical fallacy. No, it's an ethical fallacy. It is a misleading use of ethics. Also, you'll see the appeal to tradition. It has always been thus. Why? Why has it always been thus? Do I know that's true? Why is change something that we are not integrating into argument? And another ethical fallacy is common opinion. Common opinion says X, so therefore X must be correct. That is not necessarily a logical conclusion, but it's an ethical flaw, an ethical fallacy. Pathetic fallacies or emotional fallacies, pathos, things like fear. If I'm appealing to your fear, if I'm fear-mongering, and you see this from the politicians as well, if we don't get COVID under control, the earth will blow up and you will all be gone. If we don't get climate control under control, then the earth will warm up and will turn into a fireball. That may have some degree of truth. Both of those may have some degree of truth, but we are playing on people's fear to make the argument acknowledged as persuasive rather than giving substantive, logical, reasoned argument. Appealing to people's pity. If you have not seen an ASPCA infomercial that lasts for hours upon hours upon hours with Sarah McLachlan's beautifully haunting voice singing sadly in the background with the puppies in the cages, then you've been fortunate, because that is the longest appeal to pity known to man. I'm exaggerating, that's hyperbole, but it is an example of appealing to your pity. Is it something that they can't find a logical argument about, so they're substituting their appeal to pity? Is it misleading you because of that appeal to pity, playing on the pathetic appeal, but intentionally misusing it in some way? That's just an example. And another element of a pathetic fallacy is appealing through ridicule, ridiculing the other person, ridiculing an institution or a belief system. And then we want to look at the logical appeals, the logical fallacies. So the appeal to logic, the fallacies that we see, and that's what most of the information on the PowerPoint is. It's things like appealing to a straw man, creating a straw man to divert your attention from the real issue, using a slippery slope where one conclusion seemingly leads to the other and to the other and to the other, and at the end of it, the beginning doesn't look anything like the end. There's a number of those, appealing to the man instead of or attacking the man instead of the issue, so ad hominem. So we'll look at those fallacies. I won't go over them in this lecture, but they're on the PowerPoint and they're on those web pages I posted. Fallacious appeals to devices, and remember the devices are the decorative strategies. Some of them appealing to style, so things like playing on words. Some of you hit this really well in the advertisements. The clever use of language. The play on words was what became appealing rather than the product itself that was being advertised. That is a fallacy in itself, a fallacy of style, a fallacy of appealing to rhetorical devising correctly, using the rhetorical devising correctly. Playing on words, using metaphors either incorrectly or as a sleight of hand to get you into a mood or away from the lack of logic about something. Using sound, you can see this constantly when you're at, for example, a football game, a college football game especially. The use of sound, the chants, the music, the things to get the crowd into it. When they're focusing on the game, are they looking at the game, or is it the whole experience? Or, for example, you're going into a movie theater with surround sound. The sound becomes a character in itself, or another element that will appeal to you in some way. Take the sound out of there, take rhythm and meter and those kind of things out of something. What is left behind? The other thing to think about is when someone says, that was stated really well, but you want to think in the back of your mind, was it stated well because it's not logical, or is it incorrect in some way and that's why it was stated well? Always be suspicious. If nothing else from this class, I want you to be suspicious. Be a suspicious analyst of everything, because it makes you ultimately a better reader. It makes you a better writer. But the reason you want to be a better evaluator of things is it helps you become a better consumer. It helps you become a better employee. You can control your destiny more when you start seeing how people play you. And it's not necessarily to say that people are naughty or bad or ill-intended, but you want to protect yourself. You want to protect your family from things that might be devious in some way or fallacious in some way. So I'm going to leave you finally with this last little bit about logical fallacies specifically, or fallacies in general. So you want to recognize fallacies in your own logic, in your own writing, your own appeals and devices, so that you maintain authority and control, instead of instantly ceding authority and control to your reader. You want to be able to recognize fallacies in opponents or in counter arguments specifically, or simply in other people's writings, so that you can assess their credibility. Remember, as an analyst, as an audience, you want to take control of that text, and the author is trying to keep control of that text. And so that interplay is about credibility and authority control. You want to look for any kind of area that compromises the proof or the effectiveness, the proof or the persuasiveness of an argument. Remember, thesis is an overall argument that you have to prove through a series of claims and evidence. You are looking for anything that compromises that proof as a reader, and also in your own writing when you're revising your work. Look for those elements that are really pushing on your credibility. You want to look at things that push on your ethics as a writer, your ethos, your own ethos, that push on your logic, on your use of logic, your appeals to logic, and also on your emotional appeals. If you're too over the top, you've already lost control. Your audience will start thinking that you are whining, or you are too emotional, or they'll categorize or stereotype you in some way rather than giving you full control and authority that you should have in your writing. Remember too that fallacies can be misleading, and if it's intentional, then shame on you for intending to mislead your audience, because you've compromised your integrity there. If it's incidental, coincidental, that can be forgiven. But if it's intentional, it can be dangerous. You see these kind of actions often with politicians or businesses, or even individual criminals who will come up with ideas and spin them in such a way that they can lead to great harm. So you want to be careful in your own use of your appeals, so that you're not intentionally fallacious using fallacies, but you also want to be able to identify things that are fallacies in your own world for your own safety. And then thinking about too, ultimately, this class is about becoming a stronger writer, a better writer, a clearer writer. And so you need to recognize things that are fallacious in writing, things that can compromise your control and authority, can compromise your strength. If you have these kind of logical fallacies under control, so that you know you don't have any fallacies in your work, then you have made a very strong argument. You've given yourself that much more of a leg for authority and control. To be a better analyst can make you a better reader and evaluator, so that you become yourself a better writer and author holding authority. So there's one way I understood this. So one of the textbooks that I used a few years ago at University of Northern Colorado, we used a text called Writing in Response by Matthew Parfit. I've referenced it a couple of times in this class, but he summarizes the difference between logic and rhetoric. So when we're talking about analysis and writing, one way to understand is we're summarizing, concluding this section on rhetorical analysis and on the arguing to persuade. He identifies logic as the interior principles that you use to hold your argument together. So things like structure and thesis and claims and evidence and the so what, things we've been talking about as writers. The interior principles to hold that argument together, to structure it. He understands then rhetoric is the external features that make that argument attractive to that specific audience. So the devices and the appeals are the things that attract. It's the decoration on the outside of the house or the decorative features on the walls versus what goes in the walls and holds that structure together. I thought that was a really useful analogy, useful understanding of how logic and rhetoric work together and why we're looking at those in analysis. What we really want to think about or start to think about in writing and in analysis, how does all this work in the real world? So we can sit and analyze Dr. Seuss and have a great time. If we were meeting in class, we'd be making lots of fun of the images that are in that text. I mean, he's a very clever children's illustrator as well as author. We'd be looking at King's letter and breaking down individual words and structures. We'd be seeing that out in having one-on-one discussions or in group discussions, talking about those texts in person. But in real world, what do? How do we understand what we're doing in this class, in the internet, online? How do we understand that in the real world? So one way to think about using those decorative devices, the rhetorical strategies that we talked about, are for cover letters for job applications or letters of intent, letters of purpose for applications for graduate school or for transfer application letters for those of you going on to university for your third and fourth year of bachelor degree programs, or even further along the way. Sometimes you have to write a letter of application or a letter of purpose, they call them as well. You want to decorate your structure in some way to appeal specifically to that audience. So in that way, cover letters rely on rhetoric as well as the logic. Advertisements, we saw that in that exercise that we just finished up. Political issues, oh my gosh, you guys, if we can get to the end of this election cycle with our sanity, it will be a blessing. But the political issues always rely on rhetorical strategies to try to make that final appeal to voters. And then also in the real world, we want to think about writing strategies, writing logically. The clearer you are, the more authoritative you can be, the less reason you give somebody to make fun of your writing or find flaws in your writing, the stronger you'll be as a candidate for whatever job. You can be the best employee, frontline employee, you can be a spectacular boss. I had a boss when I was first at Colorado State Patrol, which is where I work full-time, and this particular manager could not write effectively. She had a very difficult time writing incomplete sentences. She had a very difficult time gathering her thoughts in a logical train. And the end result was she had less authority in many people's minds because she couldn't communicate effectively. I have a manager now who is a very strong writer, and his authority is effectively doubled because of his very strong communicative skill in writing. And just that simple action of making somebody feel your value through writing is why we want to look at analytically what's effective, what's ineffective. So finally, the last thing I'll say and then leave you to the Sneetches, which is a fun text, and gosh, who doesn't want to read a kid's book for an English class in college? So the last thing about analysis is you're looking at how a text works, not what it says. And I had a great question this week in email, and the student asked, do I need to summarize a specific portion? No, assume that your reader knows the text you're analyzing, because it's up to them to know that text, not up to you to explain what that text says. But it is up to you to explain how that text does what it's doing. So I'll leave that with you. I hope you enjoy Dr. Seuss this week. I hope you're getting through everything. Enjoy the beautiful weather we finally got. I hope you have a wonderful week. Please let me know if you have any questions, and keep up the great work.